The Second World War has closed its final chapter, but a new silent war has begun in the thin air above the Mojave. We are witnessing a race not for territory, but for the very conquest of speed and fire. Gentlemen, look to the heavens, for the age of the propeller is dead. We are now in the era of the rocket. Out of the hangars of North American aviation rolls a machine that defies the natural laws of flight. We knew the X-15 as the Black Bull, a silhouette of Inconel steel against the blue sky. But today, we reveal a different beast, a phantom, the X-15A2. It does not wear the dark coat of its brothers. No, this machine is clad in a ghostly white, a spectral warrior prepared to do battle with the heat barrier itself. Science tells us that friction is the enemy. At 6 times the speed of sound, the air itself turns into a blast furnace. The engineers at North American faced a crisis. The steel skin of the original X-15 would soften like butter in a skillet at these ungodly velocities. Their answer? A suit of armor painted on with a spray gun. They call it the Martin MA-25S ablative coating. But speed demands fuel, and the thirst of the XLR-99 rocket engine is unquenchable. Behold the silhouette of the A2. It carries massive external propellant tanks slung beneath its belly like bombs. These are not weapons of war, but reservoirs of liquid ammonia and oxygen, feeding the engine for those crucial extra seconds needed to push the needle past Mach 6 as the white bird screams upward, lighter and faster than ever before. Observe the tail. The forces here are unpredictable. In the violent shock waves of hypersonic flight, this very engine will create a blowtorch effect, searing the tail of the aircraft and threatening to sever the controls. Major Pete Knight is the man strapped into this Roman candle. He is not merely a pilot. He is a rider of explosions. He is guiding a machine that has been lengthened, reinforced, and rebuilt from the twisted wreckage of a previous crash to become the fastest winged aircraft in history. Prepare yourselves. The countdown has begun. The B-52 mothership is at altitude. The hooks are ready to release. We are about to punch a hole in the atmosphere at 4,500 miles per hour. Here is the story of the North American X-15. The most dangerous moment in the history of aviation usually begins with a roar. A jet engine spooling up to maximum RPM. A massive Saturn V rocket igniting on the pad. Tires screeching on tarmac as a fighter jet kicks in the afterburner. But for the North American X-15, the most dangerous moment began with absolute silence. Imagine for a moment that you are William Pete Knight. The date is October 3rd, 1967. You are not sitting on a runway. You are sitting in a cockpit so cramped that your helmet constantly scrapes the canopy glass. You are strapped into an ejection seat that, historically, pilots do not trust. And you are hanging 45,000 feet above the harsh, brown expanse of the Mojave Desert. You are not flying. You are cargo. Your aircraft, a 50-foot-long white needle, is tucked tightly under the right wing of a B-52 bomber. You are waiting for the drop. Inside the cockpit, the environment is hostile. You are breathing pure oxygen. The suit you are wearing is a silver multi-layered pressure suit, the direct ancestor of the spacesuits that will one day walk on the moon. Without it, your blood would literally boil at the altitudes you are about to reach. Behind your seat sits 18,000 pounds of anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen. It is a volatile bomb waiting for a spark. Over the radio, the countdown begins. It is a ritual, a rhythmic chant of checklists and switch flips. Launch light is on, you say. Your heart rate is climbing, not from fear, but from focus. Then the final command. Drop. There is a heavy metallic clunk, the sound of 3 massive hooks releasing their grip. For 1 heart-stopping second, there is no sound, no engine, no vibration, just the rush of wind and the stomach-churning sensation of falling. The X-15 drops like a stone, losing altitude, separating from the safety of the mothership. The B-52 banks away sharply to the left to escape the coming violence. And then, you flip the switch. Ignition. A flame 50 feet long, studded with shock diamonds, erupts from the tail. You are kicked back into your seat with a force that pins your chest to your spine. In 90 seconds, you are not just flying, you are outrunning the sound of your own engine. You push the throttle forward. Mach 4, Mach 5, Mach 6. On this specific day, Pete Knight pushes the machine to Mach 6.7. That is 4,520 miles per hour. At that speed, the air itself becomes your enemy. The shock waves are so violent they are trying to melt the aircraft's skin. The friction heat on the nose cone hits 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The cockpit glass is radiating heat against your face. If you make a single mistake on the stick, the plane will disintegrate before your brain can even process the error. This is the story of the North American X-15. It was the bridge between the airplane and the spaceship. It was the machine that taught NASA how to leave the atmosphere and, more importantly, how to come back without burning up. Before the space shuttle, before the International Space Station, there was the Black Bull. To understand why the United States built a plane that could outrun a high-powered rifle bullet, we have to look at the world of the 1950s. In 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. It was a monumental achievement. We had proven that the sound barrier wasn't a brick wall in the sky. It was a doorway. But once we walked through that door, we found something much scarier on the other side. Engineers called it the thermal thicket. You see, flight physics changes dramatically as you get faster. When you fly at Mach 1 or Mach 2, the air flows over your wings. But when you get to hypersonic speeds, generally defined as Mach 5 and above, the air doesn't move out of the way fast enough. It compresses, it piles up, it turns into a plasma. The molecules are smashed together so violently that the kinetic energy turns into massive heat. By 1954, the Cold War was freezing over. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a technological stare-down. The Air Force, the Navy, and the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which would soon become NASA, realized they had a problem. They needed a vehicle that could fly high enough to be a spacecraft to spy on enemies or deliver weapons, but still land like an airplane so it could be reused. They launched Project 1226. The requirements they set were considered insane by the standards of the day. They wanted a plane that could reach 6,600 feet per second and fly to 250,000 feet. That is 47 miles high. 4 major aerospace companies bid on the contract, but one design stood out. It came from North American Aviation, the legendary manufacturer that had built the P-51 Mustang for World War II and the F-86 Sabre for Korea. Their proposal was radical. It wasn't really a plane. It was a manned missile with a cockpit. They called it the X-15. The development of the X-15 was led by a brilliant, chain-smoking engineer named Harrison "Stormy" Storms. He looked at the problem of hypersonic heat and realized that standard aircraft aluminum was useless. At Mach 6, aluminum doesn't just get hot, it turns into taffy. It loses all structural integrity at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Titanium was better, but it had a tendency to absorb hydrogen and become brittle. So, Storms and his team made a bold choice. They chose a material called Inconel X. This was a nickel-chromium alloy. It was typically used inside jet engines or toasters, places that had to survive extreme heat. Inconel X could withstand 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit without losing its strength. But there was a catch. Inconel X was a nightmare to work with. You couldn't just rivet it together like a normal plane. It destroyed drill bits. It resisted bending. It had to be welded, heat-treated, frozen, and aged in massive ovens. The manufacturing process was so difficult that North American had to invent new welding techniques just to build the fuselage. Despite the innovation, the aviation world wasn't entirely convinced this black wedge would work. It was heavy, it had tiny wings, and it looked like a death trap. Scott Crossfield, who was intimately involved in the design and would become the first man to fly it, remembers the skepticism from other legendary engineers, specifically Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71.
It was a very unique kind of an airplane, and it did not have a good reputation amongst the people who had all the answers. Kelly Johnson said it would do nothing but prove the bravery of the pilot.
Kelly Johnson was wrong. It would prove much more than bravery. But first, they had to finish building it. Because of this intense heat, the X-15 couldn't carry fuel inside the wings. In a normal jet, the wings are the fuel tanks. But in the X-15, the wings would get so hot they might boil the fuel. So, the wings were solid. They were essentially thin, sharp wedges of solid alloy, sharp enough to cut your hand on the leading edge. All the fuel had to be carried in the fuselage, wrapped around the pilot. The plane was painted black. This wasn't for stealth, and it wasn't just to look cool, although it certainly did. It was a special silicone-based paint designed to withstand high temperatures and, crucially, to radiate the heat away from the airframe. The Black Bull was black for a reason: survival. A hypersonic plane needs a hypersonic engine, and this is where the X-15 truly separated itself from everything that came before it. The engineers contracted a company called Reaction Motors to build the XLR-99. To this day, the XLR-99 remains one of the most incredible engines ever built. This wasn't a jet engine that sucked in air. It was a rocket engine. It carried its own oxidizer. But unlike most rockets, which are either on or off, the XLR-99 was throttleable. The pilot could control the thrust from 50% to 100%. This was a massive engineering headache, but it was necessary for pilot safety. The fuel was anhydrous ammonia, and the oxidizer was liquid oxygen. When mixed, they produced a thrust of 57,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, at full speed and altitude, the X-15 produced roughly 500,000 horsepower. It had the power of 2 modern naval cruisers packed into a fuselage smaller than a fighter jet. However, the big XLR-99 engine wasn't ready on time. The engineering challenges were too great. So, for the first year of flights, the X-15 flew with 2 smaller XLR-11 engines, the same engines used in the old X-1. But even underpowered, the X-15 was breaking records. The X-15 could not take off from a runway. It was too heavy. Its wings were too small to generate lift at low speeds, and it burned its fuel too fast. It had to be carried. Enter the NASA NB-52. 2 B-52 bombers were modified to carry the X-plane. They cut a notch in the right wing flap to fit the X-15's tall tail. The morning of a flight was a long, grueling process. The pilot would be suited up hours before dawn. He would be driven to the B-52, climb up a ladder, and squeeze into the X-15 cockpit. The canopy would be closed, and then he would wait. The B-52 would take off and begin the slow, lumbering climb to 45,000 feet. This climb took about an hour. For the pilot inside the X-15, this was the worst part. It was boring, it was uncomfortable, and it was tense. He would constantly check his instruments, resetting the inertial navigation system, checking pressures. One of the most critical instruments was the cue ball. If you look at photos of the X-15, you'll see a round ball on the very tip of the nose. This was the hot nose. It contained sensors to measure the angle of attack and side slip. Because at Mach 6, standard pitot tubes simply melt off. The cue ball was made of Inconel and cooled by nitrogen. It was the pilot's lifeline. If the cue ball failed, the pilot wouldn't know his angle of attack, and at hypersonic speeds, if you turn too sharp, the plane snaps in half. By 1960, the big engine was installed, and the program began to push the envelope. But the pilots quickly discovered that the X-15 had a split personality. It wasn't just a fast plane. It was an unstable beast that fought you every inch of the way. In the thick air of the lower atmosphere, it used rudders, ailerons, and elevators. But the control surfaces were incredibly sensitive, and the power was overwhelming. Scott Crossfield, the first man to fly it, describes the terrifying instability of those early flights with raw honesty.
The X-15 was like a bucking stallion, I'll tell you. It was going to kill me, or we were in a Mexican standoff for a while. But we finally broke it, and it turned out to be a good mount.
They broke the stallion, but mastering the atmosphere was only half the battle. The X-15 was designed to fly to 250,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is so thin it is effectively a vacuum. Imagine driving a car on ice. You turn the steering wheel, but nothing happens. That is what happens to aerodynamic controls in space. A rudder needs air to push against. No air, no turn. So the engineers installed the Reaction Control System, RCS. These were small thrusters located in the nose and the wingtips, fueled by hydrogen peroxide. When the pilot moved a controller on the left side of the cockpit, these jets would puff out steam, pushing the nose up, down, left, or right. This meant the pilots had to master two completely different ways of flying. They had to transition from aerodynamic flight to ballistic flight and back again, all while moving at 5 times the speed of sound. Joe Engle, who flew the X-15 and later the space shuttle, explains that this wasn't a simple switch you could flip. It was a terrifyingly gradual process.
It turned out that it was not, there was no magic line, altitude line where you quit, where airplane flying quits and where space flying begins. The atmosphere gets less dense very, very slowly. And the higher you go, the rate of change is even less. So it's a very subtle transition from flying conventional airplane controls to flying reaction controls.
That subtle transition was the most dangerous part of the flight. The pilot had to blend the two systems, fading one out while fading the other in, relying on instinct as much as instruments. One wrong move during that handover could send the aircraft into a spin from which there was no recovery. The program had 3 aircraft and 12 pilots. Among them were future legends like Neil Armstrong and Joe Walker. The missions were split into 2 categories, speed and altitude. The altitude missions were the most visually spectacular. On August 22, 1963, Joe Walker sat in X-15 number 3. His mission was to go as high as possible. He dropped from the B-52, lit the engine, and pulled back on the stick. He climbed at a steep 38-degree angle. He wasn't flying, he was riding a rocket. The engine burned for about 85 seconds and then shut down. But momentum is a powerful thing. The X-15 continued to coast upward, leaving the atmosphere behind. Joe Engel recalls exactly what that transition looks like through the tiny quartz windows of the cockpit.
It's relatively low when you look up and it's black. It's not a blue sky anymore, it's total blackness. And you look out to the horizon and you can see the banding on the atmosphere, from black to purple to dark blue to light blue to the earth.
Joe Walker reached the top of the arc at 354,200 feet. That is 107.9 kilometers. He had crossed the Kármán line. He was officially in space. Inside the cockpit, a loose pencil floated in front of his face. He was weightless. He looked out the window and saw the curvature of the Earth stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. Even for hardened test pilots trained to suppress their emotions, this view changed them.
Looking back at the Earth from space and seeing how delicate, how beautiful it is, and how we really all do live on just this one ball out in the middle of nowhere, it makes you realize that we do need to work together and get along together.
For a few minutes, the X-15 was a spaceship, and Walker was a philosopher. But flight in the X-15 is a parabola. What goes up must come down. As Walker fell back toward Earth, the G-forces built up. He had to carefully re-enter the atmosphere. If the nose was too low, he would burn up. If it was too high, he would bounce off. Speaking of bouncing off, we have to talk about Neil Armstrong. Before he was the commander of Apollo 11, he was an X-15 pilot. And on flight 3-39-62, he had one of the wildest rides in the program's history. Armstrong was testing a new self-adaptive flight control system. As he re-entered the atmosphere, he pulled up to test the G limiters. But the system held the nose up too long. The X-15 literally skipped off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond. He stayed high and he stayed fast.
And Neil his attention was diverted, and I don't recall what the incident was on board, but he started a rate of climb and started climbing back up, and by the time the ground realized that and called him, it was too late to roll over and try and suck down. He just skipped over Edwards and Palmdale and finally ended up making the turn over Burbank, and then had of course the task of going to maximum lift to drag ratio, glide angle, and trying to stretch the glide back to the lake bed at Edwards, landing the other direction, coming in from the south rather than north like we normally do. But man, he made it. He did exceptional piloting skill to get the airplane to fly good enough performance to make it back to the field. A good lesson learned there too.
It was the longest flight of the program, 12 minutes and 28 seconds.
It took an immense amount of concentration to not make those mistakes that very often could be fatal.
It proved that Armstrong had the ice-cold nerves and the calculating mind NASA needed for the moon. By 1967, the goal was pure speed. The engineers wanted to push past Mach 6, but they hit a thermal wall. The friction was becoming so intense that they feared the Inconel X frame would fail, and they simply didn't have enough fuel to push through the drag. They took the second X-15, the X-15A2, and modified it.
Mach 6 was about the maximum speed that it could obtain with the propellant that it had on board. There was an attempt to go much faster with the X-15 than its design limit of Mach 6, and that was to add additional propellant in the form of external tanks that would be dropped off.
With those massive tanks, they hoped to reach Mach 8. But they needed protection. They covered the entire plane in a spray-on ablative heat shield called MA-25S. Interestingly, when they applied it, the plane turned a bizarre pinkish-orange color. The Black Bull had become the Pink Eraser. Before flight, they applied a white sealant topcoat, so it looked like a white ghost. On October 3, 1967, Pete Knight took this white ghost into the sky. He dropped the tanks, lit the main engine, and held on. The acceleration was relentless. He hit Mach 6.7, that is 4,520 miles per hour. To this day, that remains the official world record for the fastest manned-powered aircraft. The famous SR-71 Blackbird flew at Mach 3.2. Pete Knight flew more than twice as fast. But the price was high. When Knight landed, the beautiful white plane was scorched. The shock waves had focused like blowtorches on the scramjet test engine attached to the lower tail.
The overlaying shock waves just increased the heating even that much more at those hypersonic speeds, and at about 6.7, the shock wave from this little dummy scramjet engine impinged on the lower ventral and literally burned it off. And so it was determined that that was enough. Even trying to protect the X-15 with a ablative coating didn't help.
It melted the metal and burned through the white coating. The plane never flew that fast again. The limits of material science had been reached. For a program that dealt with explosions, Mach 6 speeds, and spaceflight, the X-15 had a miraculous safety record. But aviation is a numbers game, and as Scott Crossfield, who saw many friends perish in test flights, reminds us, the margin for survival was always slim.
I knew the hazards of aviation. Of course, I lost an awful lot of friends in airplanes because it's really all I've been involved in. For the research airplanes, we flew for 30 years, and we lost 5 pilots. And that's not bad. Now, that's not the high hours that we're talking about.
But on November 15th, 1967, the luck ran out. Major Michael Adams, a stellar pilot, took X-15 number 3 up for flight 191. This was the altitude ship, the same one Joe Walker had flown to space. The climb was normal. Adams reached 266,000 feet, but at the peak, an electrical disturbance spiked the system. The control lights flickered. Adams, distracted by the panels, didn't notice the plane was drifting. In the vacuum of space, the nose yawed 15 degrees to the right. Adams was suffering from vertigo, spatial disorientation. He felt like he was flying straight, but he was flying sideways. As the plane fell back into the thick air at Mach 5, the sideways airflow caused a hypersonic spin.
Mike, because of not being perfectly aligned for entry into the atmosphere, he had some yaw set up. The airflow at the high angle of attack got underneath, pulled up on the lower ventral fin. The upper ventral fin was behind all the shock waves, and the airplane went into an oscillation, and in about 3 oscillations it was out of control. And that was something that was predicted from simulators and from data that we had collected till then. And it was a matter of an instrument in the cockpit giving a wrong indication of when you're lined up for entry.
The X-15 spun wildly, like a falling leaf, but at thousands of miles per hour. The MH-96 adaptive control system tried to correct it, fighting the pilot's inputs. The control surfaces snapped to full deflection. The G-forces spiked to positive 15 Gs and negative 15 Gs. The human body cannot survive that. The airframe cannot survive that. At 62,000 feet, the X-15 broke into pieces. The wreckage was scattered over 50 square miles. Mike Adams was killed. It was a brutal reminder that the edge of space is an unforgiving place. Adams was posthumously awarded his astronaut wings, joining the ranks of those who gave their lives for the stars. The program ended in 1968 after 199 flights. There was supposed to be a 200th flight, but technical delays pushed it back until the plug was finally pulled. Yet the X-15 didn't really die. It just changed shape.
Well, in the end, it turned out to be one of the most productive research vehicles we ever had, and probably paved a lot of ground going into space that we wouldn't have had information on. both with atmosphere, heating rates, aerodynamics, and all those things that it takes.
It paved the ground, specifically, for the space shuttle. If you look at the shuttle, you are looking at the direct descendant of the X-15. The X-15 proved that pilots could fly into space and return to a runway. It provided the data for the heat-resistant tiles. Most importantly, it taught engineers how to automate the terrifying transition from space to atmosphere.
We learned it was necessary to develop a flight control system that could sense when the aerodynamic surfaces were becoming ineffective and therefore augment them with reaction controls to most efficiently fly the exit and the entry. And that flight control system, for the entry flight control system on the space shuttle, is a direct derivative, and the same techniques are used only in software in the flight control system as was developed on the X-15.
Even the computers changed. During the program, the flight data became so complex, they had to start using digital computers to process it, paving the way for the fly-by-wire systems we use in modern airliners today. The X-15 was the grandfather of the modern aerospace world. It occupies a strange, quiet place in history. It wasn't a weapon of war. It wasn't a vehicle of exploration like Apollo. It was a teacher. It was a machine built by slide rules, welded by hand, and flown by men who wore silver suits and had nerves of steel. It was loud, violent, and unapologetically fast. When pilot Milt Thompson was asked about the experience, he said, "It was the only aircraft I ever flew where I was glad when the engine quit." That sums up the X-15. It was a beast that you didn't really fly. You survived it. Today, X-15 number 1 hangs in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and number 2 rests in the Air Force Museum in Dayton. They look small. Their skin is buckled from the heat. They look like artifacts from a different civilization. And in a way, they are. They are from a time when we decided to see how fast we could go, just to see if we could survive the answer.
Here at Edwards Air Force Base, September 17, 1959 is a historic date. Early on this Thursday morning, the B-52 carrier takes the X-15 out for its maiden powered flight.
Hydraulic temperature, Scott? -2, and holding since we passed the tower.
Test pilot Scott Crossfield is buckled in and ready for a ride to 40,000 feet, where he'll be cut loose for the first demonstration of this plane's abilities and performance. Flying chase will be Al White, North American's alternate, Joe Walker, NASA's chief test pilot, and the Air Force project pilot, Major Bob White. All vital observers today. They'll be at the controls of the X-15 in the near future. Ground crews climb in a variety of vehicles and stream out to wait for landing at the edge of the lake bed. Many eyes are on the dart-shaped plane this morning, but among the most important observers are the engineers at NASA. Using the ears of radio and the eyes of radar, they'll keep a close watch on the flight. FM signals transmitted will indicate the condition of each vital operating system. Each movement will be carefully plotted, carefully watched.
Edwards 003.
003, Edwards, cleared for takeoff.
Winds 220 degrees at 12 knots.
prime responsibility for getting the X-15 to drop altitude rests on the aircraft commander, Captain Charles Bach, and the co-pilot, Captain Allaby.
Any tower, 003, rolling now.
As the bomber climbs out, the litany of checkout drones on. Item after item. Gauge, switch, and control are checked and rechecked. In the dim interior of the 52, Bill Berkowitz, launch monitor, has a close-up television view of system operation. The group has been this route before. 2 tries, 2 misses. The first try never left the ground. The second came agonizingly close, just 3 minutes from a drop, when a frozen valve canceled the effort. Delays are difficult to accept, but each time the system at fault was improved and a problem eliminated.
CPU is coming on now. First. Right. Big 2 on now. Real slow to pick up hydraulic pressure.
Blink, how about it? It's a little slow, but it's up to speed now.
It grabbed off in about 5 seconds, and it did go over 3,600. All flat, 510 on the tank. 3 minutes to drop. One to jettison. Fuel jettisoning. Full jettisoning. Okay, good check. Prime's coming on now. 6 call prime. Watch out, but I can't see it. Yeah, I got, you got a blossom on the bottom one? Yeah, they're both looking good. 30 seconds, get me ready to launch light. Get a launch light on. Launch light on, master on.
How about it, Blake? Think we're okay? Okay? All right, by me, let's go. Okay, Scott, let's give it a try.
Okay, Scotty, you ready? I'm ready when you are, buddy. Okay, here we go with the countdown. 3, 2, 1, release. Got 8 of them going. Roger. Heading uphill at 33,000 feet. Roger. It's good across the board. And I'm on number 1 and climbing at 35. Roger. Direction looks good, Scotty. Right on, you look real good. Okay, fine. Up on 50. Level. Right.
The course for this flight is a giant rectangle around the lake, climbing to the north, then making a left turn to a westerly heading, and leveling off at 52,000 feet.
See a little speed, but ease off. Right. Left turn. Right. I'm beginning to come around the final part of the turn. I dropped back at Mach number.
The record showed Mach 2.1, over twice the speed of sound, 1,385 miles an hour.
Burn out. Right.
On the first try, man and plane went 1/3 the way to the goal of 6 times the speed of sound. As the X-15 slows to subsonic speeds, the chase planes catch up and the glide portion of the flight begins. Now on a southerly heading, Crossfield begins his long glide to landing from 46,000 feet. Time in the air is precious, and the checkout continues all the way down.
Roll pulse. Steady side slip. Very powerful rudder on this little baby. Got ventral? Okay, buddy, just a second. 8,000. I want to drop it on the track. Here comes ventral now. You ready? Parachute deployed. You're fouled up. Roger. You're fouled up? No, the parachute, well, it's open. It's letting it down. How nice. 245. 245. It's pretty a crosswind, isn't it? Get it down. 240. Yeah, 240. Coming down, and it looks good. Nice and easy, Daddy. Short 210.
Maiden flight, a success. Today, flight research took another significant step forward here at Rogers Dry Lake. This lake bed has witnessed many significant events in the history of aviation. Born this day was a new tool for flight research. Using a new machine to probe into the unknown calls for caution, and weeks later the second flight showed that the performance could be repeated and excelled. Digesting the knowledge from these first tries, the program became more ambitious, and another step up the ladder was planned, one that would extend the operating area. Countdown for powered flight begins at midnight. The previous week has seen many test hurdles, each one met and overcome, each one establishing with greater authority the right of the X-15 to be in this fueling area. All the control points have been passed this far, and now the touchy, toxic, volatile propellants are added one by one. As tanks are gradually filled, crew members take long last looks into the vitals, then close the doors. Dawn finds the service carts being pulled away, with the two aircraft again standing ready. Even the most carefully controlled experiment has its element of risk, and the sober faces of every member of the team reflect their concern. Each research flight has fresh new goals. Each one is a cautious step forward into unexplored areas. The intention of this flight is to make a straight climb to 80,000 feet, hitting Mach 2 at the peak. The now routine checks of plane and engine pass uneventfully, and just past 9 in the morning, the third voyage of the X-15 begins.
I got a fire, Scott, like shut down. Plane shut down. Shut down. Going to shut it. We'll land on Rosemont.
In a split second, the plan of exploration is abruptly changed to one of survival as the pilot feels out the plane for damage and heads for Rosamond, an emergency landing area. Never has the pilot been more vital. Now it's his responsibility to get the plane on the ground safely if he can.
Hey, Scott, Jensen, the Central anytime. Central coming off now. Central off. It's off. 30 feet. 20. 10. 5.
Trouble came in pairs on this day. The engine failure was complicated by a structural break, and both were at this time unexplained. The plane was on the ground, the pilot safe, but there were new problems. Investigators found that the rocket engine had suffered an ignition failure, leaving a chamber loaded with explosives. When this mixture finally ignited, the chamber ruptured. This explosion triggered another series of events leading to additional damage. Under normal conditions, the tanks are almost emptied, but jettison in a nose-down emergency glide leaves more propellants, more weight in the fuselage. Because of this increased weight, the nose of the plane had to be higher than usual during landing. Although the touchdown was smooth, the nose-up angle was beyond the design limits, and the break occurred when the nose wheel slammed to the ground. A day and a half after the accident saw the airframe in its original jigs at the factory. The damage that seemed crippling was quickly repaired and the broken halves rejoined. This whole project is one set to gain knowledge, and even from failures, lessons are learned. The fuselage was strengthened and landing gear was redesigned to absorb more shock. The rocket engines were modified to increase reliability. 5 weeks after the unsuccessful try, the plane, now whole and improved, began its trek back to Edwards Air Force Base. Weeks have slipped by since the accident, but the time has been traded for knowledge. More is known now. Certain hazards have been ruled out. The machine is better, more able. This is the #1 plane of the series, modified, improved, and set to show its capabilities. It hangs frosted, smoking, ready.
Back here. And they look all the way across the floor. Back in the photo again.
Pouring on the rocket power, the X-15 streaks to a new high of Mach 2.5. 1,660 miles an hour at 67,000 feet. January saw the #1 airplane make its final qualifying flight. Delivery to the Air Force and NASA started a new crew on acceptance check and pre-flight readying. Joe Walker, Chief Research Pilot of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was the first to show that the X-15 is not a one-man airplane. At this time, 2 X-15s were flight ready. #1 was involved in the Air Force NASA program to take the airplane with its present engines and push it to the limit of its abilities. And Joe Walker's first flight denotes the start of this research phase. The #2 plane was still being flown by North American for investigation of stability, control, flying qualities.
Okay, that's nice, Joe. Turn a little to the right now. I would say that's okay. Okay, we got all 8 going now. All right, everything looks good. Okay, I need to check in on how far out I get now. Okay.
The drop was standard, the flight routine, the landing uneventful. 2 weeks later, another new face appeared. Major Bob White climbed the ladder to the cockpit to try his hand at rocket plane flying. An hour and a half later, the X-15 Pilots Club had another new member. The Air Force's project pilot had made his initial run and now was ready to start some serious research flying. The spring of the year saw a flurry of activity with 2 X-15s flying and North American racking up 9 drops with the number 2 airplane. The Air Force and NASA alternated pilots on a separate series of 9 research expeditions, flights that kept inching up on the world speed and altitude records. Both company and governmental pilots kept investigating the flight abilities of the planes in different quarters, feeling out the new machines, steadily pushing the operating area out farther, gaining confidence. All flying during this period was done with the XLR-11, the small engine package. Its thrust of 16,000 pounds was adequate for early investigations, but everyone was waiting for the big engine. The XLR-99, a brute that would blast out nearly 60,000 pounds of thrust to drive the plane to peak speeds and altitudes. This engine is installed in the 3rd and last plane of the series, which has always been slated to be the test bed for this new power plant. And Crossfield uses his time in between flights to ring out the installation. Preliminaries are out of the way, and this run will be one of the final before flight. This long-awaited engine can be throttled, having an idle output of 30,000 pounds, but able to be regulated between idle and 60,000 pounds of thrust. Today's runs are the climax of a long series of tests proving the installation. After this start, they're ready for flight.
South malfunction. Throttle off. Reset.
In a split second, years of planning, months of test and grinding work went up in smoke. There was only one real observer, one eyewitness, the pilot, Scott Crossfield. Scott, what was your immediate reaction?
Well, it was the biggest bang that I'd ever heard. Fortunately for me and the airplane, the explosion blew the forward section, the tanks, and the cockpit out of the blaze, or out of the major part of the blaze. And the firemen were right on their toes, and they moved in to blanket the tanks and the fire area with foam. The first reaction we had was that the engine had blown up, but like many first impressions, this was wrong. As soon as the parts cooled down, a disenchanted group of engineers moved in, and as you might imagine, things were pretty well scattered about. We also took a close look at the film that you've just seen, and here are a couple of frames that gave us our first clue. Just before the blow-up, a cloud of vapor appeared ahead of the engine. So the search was concentrated on this area. Following up this lead, we found that the hydrogen peroxide tank had been rammed, smashed open. But with what? Lining up with the tank is the center structure of the ammonia tank, and its shape matched the impacted area of the hydrogen peroxide sphere. But how could this part fail? Likely through overpressure. Now, a check of the instrumentation showed tank pressures far over normal. Again, the question, why? The pressure regulator was recovered and checked. It was determined that freezing caused by the very low temperature pressurizing gas had caused the regulator to stick full open. But there's a safety, a valve to relieve overpressure. This valve and the entire relief system was also checked. Here it was determined that a flow-sensitive relief valve combined with a vapor disposal equipment had created enough back pressure to fail the tank. So, a frozen regulator, a faulty relief valve, and a high back pressure relief system had gotten together, and we had wrecked an airplane. The entire pressurizing and release systems were analyzed, redesigned, tested, and retested. We ran the combination time after time, deliberately creating the most severe failures possible. Weeks passed before we and everyone else were convinced that the problem was licked. As a measure of how the confidence was restored, here is what happened on the 4th of August.
On this historic date, Joe Walker let out a yip of joy. He had just pushed the modified small-engine airplane to a new speed record, then made his report to the public.
How does it feel to be the fastest living human?
I don't know if I feel much different than I did yesterday, except that the waiting for the flight is over finally.
6165. Call it back area, Joe. Roger.
Gyro looks like.
Deployed. Over. Go. Burn out. +3+. You made it.
At what point did you reach your maximum speed?
If you notice the vapor trail from the engine, at the instant it cut off, that was the point at which I reached the maximum speed.
Now, what was your altitude then?
Around 66,000.
How long were you going that 2,150 miles?
Just one instant.
Then, on the 12th of August, just 8 days later, Major Bob White was up before the cameras after his 136,500-foot record-breaking altitude flight.
The flight today offered, I would say, no problems, and nothing that could be considered a limitation as far as man's ability to fly an aircraft.
Ready, we'll pull up. Right. Right on the track. Your angle looks good, Bob. You're going up. S9.
Once I pitched up and reached the highest climb angle, I was very definitely impressed that I was going, well, almost straight up. Of course, it wasn't straight up, but it appears to be that way from the cockpit.
Are you coming up on 10 now? Okay. Angle's very good. Going through 11 now. Burn out. Burn out now at coming 12 now. Got 12.6 and 13. Very sensitive. That's still good. That's fantastic up here.
What you see at this altitude impressed me as being the most dramatic point of flying at over 130,000 feet. The very dark blue sky and the lighter band that was immediately surrounding the Earth, and then, of course, the many, many miles off in the distance that you're able to see. Looking to the future, I would say that we hope very much, and I would particularly like to continue on in work that would take us to higher altitudes with manned aircraft.
Now the full potential of the airplane with the small engines had been fully investigated. While the number 2 airplane was being fitted with the big engine, number 1 began a series of training flights. The full crew was now given a chance to try its hand at piloting the research plane. Commander Peterson, the Navy's representative, was the 4th man to ride the X-15. He made 2 flights in early fall. Then Jack McKay, NASA research pilot, took his first ride at the end of October. Captain Rushworth, the Air Force backup pilot, was next to show his skill at rocket plane flying. NASA pilot Neil Armstrong's last 2 flights closed the year. Training flights filled the gap while the number 2 was being given a complete checkout with the large engine. Since that ill-fated day in June when the explosion ripped the number 3 ship in half, maximum effort has been exerted toward getting another engine and installing it in Ship 2. Months of work, weeks of painstaking trials, round-the-clock days of final pre-flight were at last put to the test on the morning of November the 15th. This is the X-15 in its final stage of development. This run, if successful, will mark the beginning of a whole new era of flight research.
Camera. That's awesome. It's okay down here, Scott. Okay to go? Right. Roger. 25. Pump idle.
Idle cooling going down.
Got it. Launch.
Turning off to the right, Scotty.
The launch to tank pressure is going up to 60. And I'm going uphill. I'm reading 320. Launch brake is holding at about 55. I'm about 1-2. Dive brake's coming open. How's the lookout?
But real good, Scotty. You made about a 10-degree turn to the right when you came off.
With the new engine loafing at idle, the plane could go to 4 times the speed of sound. So the speed brakes are open to stay close to Mach 2.
It's good, Scott. A little right, of course. You're okay.
Firing ready, Rob.
Scott, could you tell us in your own words how the flight went and what you thought of it?
Very well, and the engine and its power is impressive.
What was your maximum altitude and speed? Did you have a chance to check that yourself?
Yeah, we got about 80,000 feet and a Mach number approaching 3.
Scott, your radio talk sounded a bit hesitant this morning before takeoff. What was that about?
Oh, no, I think you misinterpreted that. Of course, we've been doing the best we can to get this flight off for 5 years. There's any hesitancy there.
But having observed the minimum thrust performance of the engine, do you think that the airplane now will be able to live up to its design promises of altitude and speed? Or will it exceed it? Or how do you feel?
Yeah, really, without question. I got a little faster today than we'd planned, and we have in our previous flights, in my flights, gotten faster than we'd planned, because for once in history, we've overestimated the drag on the airplane. I think it'll exceed its original expectations.
Just 7 days later, the second flight was launched. And on the 6th of December, the third. Both showed the engine to have all the abilities claimed of it. These 2 eminently successful flights closed the year. But the story of the X-15 stands not in the past, but in the future, when every flight is a record breaker, when every trip away from the B-52 is an unparalleled research mission. Human hands will be learning a new skill to thrust deep into unexplored areas, capture vital information, then settle to a safe return from that twilight land standing between Earth and space.